when I was a student at the university, I learned that the best way to present any topic on contemporary Jewry is to divide it into two sections. The first section should be discussing the issues of the country, and the second section is to go on to the Jewish topic. And this is what I've really been taught. And Ari, if you go on to the next slide, a person who's been invaluable to me is Professor Gideon Shimoni, who you can see in the picture over there. He's a professor of contemporary Jewry, now retired from the Hebrew University. And I studied with him, and I'm very grateful to him until today for having introduced me to the world that I'll be talking about now. The other person that I'd like to thank is Dr. Nomi Shamroth, who's been very helpful to me in a back and forth where I was trying to receive additional information about South Africa. I haven't been to that country for more than 2 years now. And there are many recent developments, and she's been quite wonderful in helping me. So we can see on the screen the three central Jewish communities in South Africa at the moment. In the red arrow, we have Cape Town, a beautiful city, and we'll be seeing some pictures. Up in the north, the blue arrow, we see Johannesburg. If I use the word Joburg, that is how most South Africans refer to it. And on the eastern coast, you see Durban. Many years ago, maybe 50 or 60 years ago, the map would have looked totally different, because at that time there were Jewish communities in about 20 different places. But as years have gone by, and particularly in the last decade or so, the majority of the Jews are now living in the three centers that we see. On the next slide, we see some of the important statistics which we've received from the Kaplan Center in Cape Town. The statistics are from 2019. The report came out fairly recently. And I'd just like to take on two occasions, on this slide and later on another one, some of the important details to explain exactly what the South African Jewish community is about. I think one of the most important points is looking at the maximum figure. Some time ago, the population was 120,000. Now it's 52,300. That means South Africa has gone through a tremendous change. A very significant number of Jews have left, and we'll be discussing as we go through the session exactly who has left and probably why. And there you see three sets of statistics on the main population centers. Johannesburg with 58% of all the Jews, 30,000 people, which makes it very much the dominating center, which it has essentially been pretty much through South African Jewish history. The second is Cape Town, 24%, 1/4 of all Jews are living in Cape Town at the moment. And the smaller site is Durban, 7% with 3,400 Jews. What's fascinating about the South African Jewish community is that 89% were born in the country. So that means you have a very, very old population, old not in terms of age, but in terms of times that they have been in South Africa. It also means, by the way, that you have only a very limited number of people, Jews, coming into South Africa, according to these statistics. And I think that's a very significant point. We are therefore talking about a community which is very much aware of itself. It's a second, third, fourth generation kind of community. And they have built a very defined structure, which gives the South African Jews a great sense of pride. And they really do define themselves as a somewhat model Jewish community around the world. 86% have two Jewish parents. It is a community of very, very limited intermarriage with non-Jewish people. And this is largely due to the very defined structure, religious structure, which has developed increasingly over the years, and I'll be dealing with this in greater detail. The position in Johannesburg is clearly a more religious area. Half the people there define themselves as Orthodox or strictly Orthodox, as distinct from much lower figures in Cape Town and Durban. Why Johannesburg in particular? Well, that was the center of the chief rabbinate. And the main rabbis in South Africa, the main Orthodox rabbis, were in Johannesburg. And they managed over a period of time to really develop South African Jewry into a highly religious community. The definition of South African Jews is interesting, not unique in the Jewish world, but they call themselves Orthodox, but in many senses they're non-observant Orthodox, an unusual kind of definition, which I think in many countries of the world would not be understandable. But in what we're talking about are Jews who have been identified with the Orthodox synagogues, which have been very large and very powerful. And only relatively recently has the Reform movement come on the scene, and it still was and still is today, until today, a fairly marginal phenomenon. The figure of Jews who have gone on ALIYAH, have gone to live in Israel, is 25,000. Once again, statistics tell a major story. If the whole maximum figure was 120,000, and now 25,000 Jews went on ALIYAH, what we are actually seeing is something which I think almost every South African Jew would agree with, and that is we Southern African Jews, those that live in South Africa, and I'm using the broader term Southern, those who come from countries like Zimbabwe and Zambia, small Jewish communities, we Southern African Jews are real Zionists. That is how they, in many senses, define themselves clearly. Not all of them who have left South Africa went to Israel. The immigration figures of South African Jews in Israel is low. 13% is very low. In many countries, you'll find it somewhere in 25%, 30%. So South African Jews, when they get to Israel, they stay there. By the way, this is a two-sided issue. They stay there because Israel is appealing. They don't leave Israel and go back to South Africa because they're not always totally sure of what the future holds for Jews in South Africa. On to the next slide, we just get a little bit of some of the basic concepts of past. What is the early Jews? The early Jews who arrived in South Africa in mid-17th century came under the auspices of the Dutch East India Company. At that time, South Africa was under the auspices of Netherlands, of Holland. Only later did it become a British colony. The Jews were among the first settlers. They didn't define themselves as that. It was still somewhat awkward for certain Jews in the Netherlands to define themselves as such. The Jewish community is a Litva community, a Lithuanian-based Jewish community. They came, and at a certain time, the earlier Dutch Jews, and certainly the British Jews who came to Cape Town, were dominated by the Lithuanian Jews. The Litva Jews are very much a central theme within the Jewish community of South Africa. Clearly, other groups have come in over the years, but it sees itself very much as a Lithuanian-based community. The population went through tremendous changes in the 19th century, influenced particularly by the 1896 gold rush. There'd also been a diamond rush. Jews, traders, experiencing difficulties in Eastern Europe. As you all probably know, the end of the 19th century is a tough time in Eastern Europe. The pogroms start in the 1870s and carry on till the early 20th century. That's a good time to leave. And Jews traveled around the world at this period. And South Africa was appealing. It was a developing society. There was a need for traders. There was a need for sophisticated engineers and miners generally. And really that brought them in what is very much defined as a chain migration. Someone coming from Shtetl in Lithuania or Latvia would, after a short period of time, bring other members, and they were welcomed. Jews were originally welcomed. One of the challenges became that the Jews quite early on were maybe even considered to be too Zionist. We find as early as 1898, there are 5,000 members in a dozen Zionist societies. Pretty much at the beginning of the modern period, we see the Zionist movement is out there, and Jews are very much already defining themselves as Zionists, a very early stage of modern Zionism. The tensions start in 1899, and the Second Boer War, First Boer War was a few years earlier, but when people use the term Boer War, they're actually referring to the one we see here, 1899 to 1902, we begin to see some of the tensions that became significant some 30 years later. And that is, in looking at the Jewish community, on the one hand, you have the Boers, the Afrikaners, right-wing people, in many cases agriculturalists. Those who living in Cape Town were urban, but the others were very rural. And the dominating group at the time were the English speakers. And the story of the division within the white community is going to be multiplied as far as the Jews are concerned by virtue of the fact that it's an ongoing racially divided society. The whites at the top, Indians, coloreds, mixed race people, and then the various African Bantu tribes. Very, very divided. And right at the early stages, the white groups, the Afrikaners on the one hand and the English speakers on the other hand, were really trying to ask themselves where you Jews are committed. Where is your loyalty? In the Boer War, there was quite a significant number of Jews who identified with the Boers, with the Afrikaners, in a very, very tough war. Most of those people were those who lived fairly near Afrikaner centers, sometimes as farmers, but in many cases living fairly close to the farming communities and serving them. By 1906, the Jews who had initially been based in Cape Town moved to the north. Transvaal is the center of Johannesburg. And from their base in the Transvaal, there for a short, relatively short period of time, they're already moving to Palestine. So not only are they forming movements, Zionist movements, but they're already at an early stage. 1906 is very early in the modern development of what then became the State of Israel. You already have 35 residents being there, and this kind of phenomenon becomes important. They were there, they were active, they were seen, they were involved in many developments in Israel, and that is going to make the decision of many South African Jews to go to Israel as almost a norm. That becomes built into the nature of the South African Jewish community. In the next slide, we'll begin to see a major change. Jews who had settled down, considered themselves part of the country, had received citizenship, were welcome, no doubt about it. We find in the early part of the 20th century, we're already seeing Jews settling down, useful to the development of South Africa, partly because they were white. I mean, in a society where the majority were non-white, belonging to the three other groups, whites, particularly skilled whites coming from a country like Lithuania and England, were obviously going to be useful to the development of the country. But the 1930s in South Africa are very similar to the 1930s in many other countries of the world. 1930s, as some people might think, was really a German phenomenon of the rise of anti-Semitism and National Socialism. But the truth is that that phenomenon was really in many senses a global phenomenon. And in 1930, a Quota Act was developed, and it went on to the Aliens Act in 1937, which very much was against German Jewish refugees. After all, with the rise of National Socialism in Germany in 1933 and the increasingly anti-Semitic legislation, German Jews and later Austrian Jews and others were trying to get out of Europe as quickly as they could. This was a little bit of shock to the Afrikaner, to the right-wing Boer party, the National Party, which at that time was in opposition, where we find here a very significant quote by D.F. Malan, who later became a prime minister, and he said very, very clearly, there are too many Jews here, too many for South Africa's good, and too many for the good of Jews themselves. Quite often in reports written by South African Jews, you'll see that quote and those kind of quotes. But it wasn't only the language, it was the action. There was the formation of the Osva Brandwag, the Oxwagon Sentinel, which had some 300,000 members. And in the picture there, you can see them standing as in a guard group. Some people would kind of compare it maybe with some of the radical right-wing movements in the United States or in other countries. And there we have a picture of Hitler. This brought about a dilemma for the Jewish community. And the Jewish community at that time, realizing that of all the alternatives, to be on the side of the right had absolutely no value at all. It was much better to try and identify with a country which wasn't so easy to identify, but better certainly than the Nazis. And that was Great Britain. When I say not so easy to identify with, because we know that in Palestine, in Eretz Israel, there had already been a high level of tension with the British from the end of the First World War. But in the balance of who was better and who was worse, obviously the British were better. Therefore, South African Jews joined the British Army and the Jewish Brigade, which was active after the Second World War in particular in bringing people out of Europe. But the words went even further. And in 1948, the 1948 election, the same year that Israel received its independence, was a dramatic moment for South African Jews, which was going to bring about a tremendous tension within the Jewish community that I'll be dealing with in a short time. The Afrikaner victory under Malan and other leaders was very much committed to white domination and separate development. And those on the left of the Jewish community were very much aware that once one starts bringing about a society with discrimination, although in the early stage it was discrimination against the non-white groups, that discrimination can quite easily seep into a discrimination against the Jews as well. And therefore, from 1948 onwards starts this internal Jewish discussion of what should we do? And to try and state it fairly simply, the two alternatives were the following. Either we as Jews, in terms of our history, in terms of our Bible, the teachings of Tanakh, we Jews have to identify with the underdog because we, as a result of our history, have been underdogs in history. The other alternative was we should keep quiet because now there's a new government, and this government is not only in control, but we can imagine that will be in control for an extended period of time. So let's keep our heads low. And why I'm stating this in a somewhat simplistic way, I would essentially say that that was the ongoing tension which South African Jews had to face for an extended period of time. On to the next slide. We find that the problems don't remain within political ideology or politicking. It comes into what is going on in the field. The changes, the dilemmas, the ambivalence is very, very difficult. On the one hand, the Africans are being suppressed, and we can see that they expressed their views very clearly in 1960 with the Sharpeville demonstrations. That's the picture at the top. We see that young man carrying his brother during some very, very tough demonstrations. And in 1976, the Soweto riots, which brought about national violence. So on the one hand, we're seeing from the 50s onwards and into the 60s and into the 70s that there is an uprising, a sense of deep discrimination by the African groups, and that was obviously going to attract certain Jews. On the other hand, and this brought about a division and a tension within the Jewish community, there was another important reality. In 1953, the first foreign head of state to visit the state of Israel was the South African Prime Minister D.F. Malan, that same person who we spoke about a few minutes ago, who'd spoken in a distinctly anti-Semitic manner, saying that we don't want Jews in South Africa. But his so-called private visit, which was more than a private visit, started a very important process for the state of Israel in a situation of deep economic crisis. The 1950s and the 1960s, Israel is desperately looking for financial assistance, and South Africa allowed, against its normal restrictions, allowed Jews to send a very significant amount of money to help the development of the new Jewish state. So here on the one hand, there were those who were most concerned about the crises that the Africans found themselves in. And on the other hand, those same people were very aware that the South African government had been very helpful to the development of the new state. And this kind of dilemma, this complex situation, becomes a central issue which the South African Jewish community has had to deal with over an extended period of time, until, in a sense, independence in 1994. We will speak about that a little later. In the next slide, we begin to see some of the events which brought and emphasized the division. The rabbis in South Africa have always had a very, very distinct influence, defining the society mainly as an Orthodox society. With time, Reform rabbis came in. Reform rabbis came in from overseas. By the way, the majority of the Central Orthodox rabbis came from Britain until fairly recently. And we have two cases of Reform rabbis there. The first one is Rabbi Andre Ungar, who in 1956 had his residence permit withdrawn. There was a major tension within the Reform movement. Why had he spoken so openly in support of the Africans? Surely his job is simply and only to work with the Jewish community. Next to him, we see between the 60s and 70s, Arthur Super, once again, very involved in the opposition to the South African government until he went on ALIYAH to Israel. The two Orthodox rabbis who were on the lower level there were very much influenced by Chief Rabbi Rabinowitz. He was a former supporter of Zev Jabotinsky, the leader of the revisionist Zionist movement, and he himself was in conflict with the Board of Deputies, feeling that they had really not proven themselves to be fully anti-British. That's part of the other internal issues which are going on. And we have the rabbi who's called the struggle rabbi, Ben Isaacson, who was particularly outstanding, outspoken in terms of his criticism of apartheid. I must just say something very important about apartheid and criticism. We're talking about a time in South Africa and a regime in South Africa where open criticism was not looked at just as open criticism. It wasn't part of a regular political debate, but was very much seen in terms of loyalty or disloyalty. And as there was quite a significant number of Jews in the radical left movement, called communists, although that I think is an exaggeration of who they really were, the Jewish community constantly begins to find itself in the dilemma that I mentioned earlier. Should we stay quiet, be showing that we are totally loyal, regardless of what we feel in our gut, or are we committed as rabbis, as religious leaders, to really speak out against the government? And I think you would find many South Africans living in various parts of the world, as in Israel, would repeat how they at a certain time in their lives were grappling with some of these issues. On to the next slide, we'll begin to see what is South Africa is an extremely important phenomenon. We all know that Jewish communities form themselves with different mechanisms, different kind of organizations. That isn't the overall topic of today. But certainly in terms of South Africa, one can define essentially three frameworks which were very important in forming the collective identity of the various subgroups of the Jews. The rabbis, the rabbinical frameworks, the religious frameworks, this non-observant or non-practicing orthodoxy, that is one very important framework, and many of the Jewish people were regular synagogue attenders. The other was the youth movement. The South African youth movements have been analyzed and described in many frameworks because of their tremendous power. The study program, the schools, the public schools in particular, were apolitical on all different levels. You would never really say anything that could be suspected of being somewhat unfavorable to the government in power, which was an Afrikaans government for most of the time. The youth movements therefore fulfilled a very important role for young people. And this was the arena of critical analysis. Critical analysis in safe environments became very, very important. And the youth movements, although one thinks of youth movements as being a kind of a Boy Scouts kind of involvement only, took on distinct political perspectives. And therefore, in the case of the HABONIM-DROR movement, which was for an extended period of time by far the largest and the most powerful, attendance in the HABONIM-DROR movement already put you in some cases in a difficult position. And we know that the secret police were looking at the leaders, and there had been, in fact, at a certain time, the secret police had passed on to the Jewish community a message that we are looking at the leaders of HABONIM-DROR and the other youth movements, and you should tell them that they are getting very close to a dangerous position. This, by the way, was going to be one of the fundamental reasons why at an early stage HABONIM-DROR encouraged ALIYAH, saying there's no way that we can live with the kind of environment we want to live in, an open, analytical and critical environment. There is no way that we can live here. Therefore, Israel is our only alternative. The HABONIM-DROR movement continued for a long period of time, and in March 2020 was the start of the head talks, a fascinating phenomenon where some 1,200 people are registered every Sunday, depending where you're living in terms of whether it's in the morning, night, or very early morning. They have these talks where one begins to see the caliber of the various HABONIM-DROR movement leaders who find themselves in all parts of the world, all very, very, to a tremendous amount, highly skilled subsection of any kind of society. It is estimated that the HABONIM-DROR movement has many hundreds of thousands of people. I myself, wandering around the world on various occasions, would often find myself speaking to someone. As a youngster, I was in that movement, and it was very clear that this was a wonderful connecting place. A connecting place not as a youth organization, which is very much the American model, but the youth movement whereby young leaders from the ages of 14 and 15 onwards, young madrichim, counselors, are already taking on very important roles. And unlike the American model of the camps and other places, which are essentially controlled by an adult group, the youth movements of South Africa were very much under the auspices of people in the last years of high school or at university, a different kind of model from what one sees in many cases in the United States. In the next one, we see yet another movement, BNEI AKIVA. Now, BNEI AKIVA at a certain time was the third largest movement. It grew with time. BNEI AKIVA was fulfilling a gap for Orthodox people who were Orthodox, not just kind of non-observing Orthodox, which the expression we had used earlier, but genuinely Orthodox. And by the 1950s, when they established the yeshiva, they are slowly growing. It's been a movement which grew fairly slowly, very, very much initially somewhat similar to initially at least as a religious scouts kind of movement, initially also very much committed to the kibbutz movement in Israel. But as time goes by, as we'll see later, they moved much more into a political kind of position, somewhat like HABONIM-DROR, but took a very different political perspective from HABONIM-DROR. HABONIM-DROR is clearly a leftist, egalitarian kind of youth movement. BNEI AKIVA is a religious movement which, in terms of Israel, as we look later, took on a different kind of approach. By the 21st century, BNEI AKIVA was the dominating movement. And it's been very difficult for HABONIM-DROR, looking back at what's happened in the last 20 years or so, to realize that their movement, which was so much the dominating movement in South Africa, is no longer the case. And BNEI AKIVA is a wonderful movement. Over the years, when I've been visiting South Africa and I've met the emissaries, the shlichim, I've always been very impressed by all the emissaries. They've been people in many cases who they themselves were in South Africa, and they went to Israel and now have gone back to serve their communities for 2 or 3 years. But certainly BNEI AKIVA developed into a very, very vibrant, remarkable movement, certainly as impressive as HABONIM-DROR. The third movement, which appears in the next slide, is BETAR. The BETAR movement for an extended period of time was the second largest community. BETAR was perhaps the most directly political of the three. Early on in the BETAR ideology, they saw themselves as youngsters geared towards the ideology of Zev Jabotinsky. BETAR was formed in the 1930s in South Africa, and the centrality of this very charismatic revisionist leader, who he himself visited South Africa and had a tremendous impact on the adult community. He himself defined a BETAR in a very clear manner. The aim of BETAR is to create that type of Jew which the nation needs in order better and more quickly to build a Jewish state. And if you look closely at the picture there with Zev Jabotinsky in the background, you will be able to see that something is very significant about the BETARim. It's the uniform that they had looked somewhat military. They were their body language, which isn't the central thesis of what one can go into, but the ceremonies of the various youth movements said a great deal about who they were. And the BETAR youth movement had within it a distinct semi-military kind of component, marching, very much the uniform, kind of something which was very different from what was found initially in HABONIM-DROR, and certainly very different from the BNEI AKIVA model. Their leader in a certain time in history, in the 1940s, was Chief Rabbi Dr. Louis Isaac Rabinowitz. We've met him before in this slides. He was a passionate supporter of the Zionist revisionist movement and very critical of British actions in Palestine. Now, this is already going into double kind of complexity. The Jews of South Africa, as English speakers, were expected to be identified with the British in some way or the other, if not officially, at least emotionally. And here we have the chief Orthodox rabbi speaking out very, very clearly against British activity. We're here talking about the time in history where the refugees, the survivors from the European concentration camps, were trying to get to Israel. They were picked up by the British and sent back to the island of Cyprus or back to Europe. And this is a period where there was tremendous tension between the British and the Jews of Israel, which somehow or other filtered into South Africa and was certainly felt as a result of the language used by Chief Rabbi Rabinowitz. The BETAR movement with time declined, as did, I mentioned earlier, the HABONIM-DROR movement. We can see them, by the way, at the camp. I didn't mention in the earlier pictures, the camps, very much we know with youth movements and youth organizations around the world. It's the stay away camps, the 3-week camps, by and large in South Africa, the end of year camps, the December, January camps are near the sea. And there we've got a picture, kind of a very clear statement of identity, the 3 levels of identity of the BETAR movement, near the sea, Israeli flag, the BETAR flag, and the South African flag as well. Politically correct kind of statement, I would imagine. Thank you. On to the next one. We begin to see the other structure, which is important. I mentioned the rabbinical religious structure, the youth movement structure, and then the Jewish day schools. The Jewish day schools were tremendous in South Africa, very, very central. The overall national education, while there were some certainly good schools, were troubling to the Jewish community. Not that the Jewish community expected any political statements to be part of South African education, but they certainly expected a different level of education. And while they were private schools, they were certainly very important Christian private schools, the day school idea became absolutely vital to the collective identity of the South African Jewish community. At the Kaplan Center, once again, that very important report which I mentioned initially, if we look at the second figure there, 75% of school-aged Jewish children in South Africa currently attend Jewish schools. Now, this is not unique. I mean, it's certainly not the only country in the world that you can find that. The figures, by the way, in Mexico are even higher. But I think it says something very important. The Jewish day school is not only a place where one receives a good education and has the possibility of receiving a Hebrew and Judaic oriented lessons, but I think also says in certain countries something in addition. It says we actually do see ourselves somewhat different from the rest. And we're not really so interested in acculturating in the full sense into the wider community. And when one sees countries with such high percentages, 3 out of every 4 young children being totally involved in the Jewish day school environment, that means something. It also depends on what the curriculum is. The curriculum of the Jewish day schools, and I visited on some occasions, I visited some of the Jewish day schools, speaking on my visits about what was going on in Israel and the possibility of university studies. As one walked into the buildings, firstly, the ambience was an ambience of luxury and success, very serious studies. And we know just as a result, if we look at what happened to many of the people coming out of the Jewish day schools, getting into good universities in South Africa and excellent universities around the world, that really was a very defined statement of just how important the Jewish day schools were. By the way, not only did they have a high figure, 75% attendance, but you also get the figure, obviously, by having the money. And the South African Jewish community over the years invested a considerable amount of money to ensure that those who could not afford to go to the Jewish day schools could in fact get there. One of the programs, and many programs of Jewish day schools were involved with Israel, but one of the programs that was particularly interested was the Israel-oriented program like the South African Ulpan in Jerusalem. I myself, for a year of my life, was the director of the program in Jerusalem. And it was fascinating meeting the 15-year-old South African children in Israel, how much they had already heard about Israel. So the few months that they spent in Jerusalem was not a 101 program, but rather an extension of what they had already picked up from the 2 frameworks, the Jewish day schools and the youth movement. We can see the bottom picture is the mass of children in Cape Town. Cape Town, that beautiful city on the southern edges of South Africa, the southwestern edge of South Africa, was just one of those beautiful schools near the mountain, providing excellent education. As time went by, as part of a general development in South Africa, the Jewish day schools, which had initially started off as not really being so religious, becoming increasingly orthodox. Thank you. On to the next slide. Why did Judaism become so important in South Africa? There's a vast numbers of explanations and great interest in it. When I actually initially saw the figures of the Kaplan Center in Cape Town, produced by someone in Cape Town, David Graham in Cape Town, I was fascinated by the increasingly high level of religiosity of the Jewish community. And I think one has to realize that this phenomenon happens in only particular cases. In some countries of the world, one doesn't see that with communities, but this is very, very clear in the case of South Africa. And here I've tried to suggest some of the possibilities of explaining what happened. One is, I think, certainly that when we were speaking about HABONIM-DROR, I mentioned that there's no doubt at all that their political perspective and the feelings that they didn't want to live in an apartheid South Africa where they couldn't express their own views, and they were distinctly on the liberal leftist side of the political spectrum, they left. And so the group of people who were non-religious actually becomes less important. The other is that Judaism is a very defined mechanism of ensuring survival as you go through decline. Now, what does decline mean? South Africans until today are very much aware of the days when there were 120,000 and now they're just a little over 50,000. So in that period of demographic decline, I think the moving towards Judaism has been something which gives them a sense of security. The other factor clearly is the insecure situation of South Africa, not only the events of 1960 and 1976, but also as it moves closer to independence in 1994 and immediately after independence, the religious environment became important. It was a all-encompassing religious kind of environment. Not only was it more religious, but in the 1970s, it moves to the ultra-Orthodox level in vast numbers of different kind of communities. In the 1990s, for example, we have the importance of the Orthodox rabbinate, which has been there for an extended period of time, the Shtibel congregations, little congregations, Or Sameach, a very effective outreach program of the Or Sameach, the Chabad, which we find in many parts of the world. And it also clearly becomes a Frumkeit kind of community. That means the religiosity, kosher food, Shabbat observance, generally the aura of a broad religious society becomes very much the norm from the 1990s and is certainly true till today. There have been tensions, and that is for example, in 2009, the Chief Rabbi Goldstein, by the way, who's one of the very few Central Orthodox rabbis who himself was born in South Africa. As I mentioned, most of them came from Britain, imposed a ban on Orthodox rabbis participating in Limud. For those of you who aren't aware of what Limud is, it's this multi-level educational happening, remarkable. I've been to them in several countries in the world, very, very exciting. And they're very open-minded, different kind of views, very sort of free flow of ideas, always kosher food, but very flow ideas. And that was a restriction was put on at a certain time against Limud, which I think, if I can express a personal comment, is a great pity. It's those Limud kind of phenomenon are the wonderful meeting places of different minds. The synagogues have continued being popular. We see here a picture of the great Oxford Street Synagogue, a very auspicious, large synagogue, and you see it there. And perhaps of the many creative religious activities which have developed in South Africa is the Shabbat project. It's really quite an amazing idea. Jews, as in many parts of the world, live in very defined areas in Johannesburg in particular. And certain streets are even closed off because there are so many Jews in that street, and the neighbors are prepared to accept the closed streets for just a short period of time. And therefore you have these open air Shabbat kind of experiences. And people have told me that they've never observed a Shabbat in their life, but the Shabbat project is wonderful. No telephones, no television, no driving, no writing, but being together and good food for all. And that's once again been a very successful program for the Jews of South Africa. We are now moving on to the second section with the next slide, where we begin to see what all this is leading to. And this is leaving South Africa. I'll very quickly go on to two themes here, two surveys, 1 year between the other survey, to explain the problematics of the definition of anti-Semitism. In this particular case, which normally would not require too much discussion, in this particular case, I think it's very important. It shows that very much when the Anti-Defamation League came out with the following comment, that South Africa is the second most anti-Semitic country in the world after Poland. South African Jews were horrified. They could not understand, and they even objected to the Anti-Defamation League. They demanded to understand where those kind of statistics came from. I think that felt almost insulted by that figure. And so the Board of Deputies, the central governing umbrella body in South Africa, which has played a very important part together with the South African Zionist Federation, but this umbrella body, which is the body which we'll see is grappling all the time between government and non-government, comes out and defines very clearly that there's been a decrease in anti-Semitic comments and activity, and says very clearly the average South African Jew doesn't have a problem with anti-Semitism. The Jewish community certainly has its challenges, but it is not experiencing the same levels of hate and anti-Semitism that some other Jewish communities in the diaspora are. Anti-Semitism is there, one feels it, particularly, by the way, as we see in that bottom picture, boycott apartheid Israel, among certain sections of the Muslims, particularly those who live in the Cape area, and there are anti-Semitic comments coming from the radical left African community and also from the radical right Afrikaner community, nowadays somewhat less important. So anti-Semitism is there, but as far as South Africans are concerned, it is not a major issue. However, be it as it is, we have to remember that historical anti-Semitism is there. And therefore, even if a country at a particular moment says things are okay, memory is a powerful mechanism as being a push factor. On to the next slide, we see here who the immigrants who went to Israel is. Now, it's an unbelievably difficult task to really try and make an analysis of who immigrants from South Africa going to Israel are. So what I've tried to do is just an attempt at what as I said, is an impossible task, is to use the excellent book by Philip Gillon, which is actually available on internet, called 70 Years of South African ALIYAH, a story of achievement. Came out some 30 years ago, which gives us an excellent perspective of who the immigrants to Israel are. And I'd just like to make a personal comment. I arrived in Israel in 1967, and it was quite amazing to me as we would meet Israelis and other people, how quickly one had the feeling that South Africans and Southern African Jews, I myself are originally from Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, that how we were welcome in South Africa. We were seen as a positive group. And in trying to understand why certain groups, certain immigrant groups are seen as positive or negative, difficult issue with which requires a great deal of questioning, and the issue of stereotypes is difficult to deal with. We see that looking at this list that I presented here, only a very small list, by the way. I just tried to choose people who represented various realms, and there's no way an attempt to go through all those people of Southern African origin who've come to the State of Israel who've been important. We are talking here about a highly committed, well-educated group who tried, relatively speaking, hard to become part of the society. It doesn't mean that every South African is fully integrated into the society, but if we look at the norm of South African immigrants, we see, yes, they wanted to be part of society and they really wanted to contribute. Their contribution starts already in the 1930s, where prominent Zionist youth movements are moving to Israel, initially to kibbutz. Some of the early kibbutzim movement, 4 or 5 important kibbutzim, were very much dominated by the South African movements. The secular ones went on to HABONIM-DROR, people went on to the secular kibbutzim, and the AKIVA went on to the religious kibbutzim, both within the State of Israel and over the Green Line. And in the War of Independence between November 1947 to January 1949, we're here seeing a very important phenomenon which South Africans are very proud of, that of the 3,000 volunteers who came on Machal, the volunteers from overseas program coming to a war, very dangerous and a tough war, 810 of them were from South Africa, a very, very high percentage. And we see that South Africans, moved into the early Israel Air Force. And incidentally, the first years of the Israel Air Force was an English-speaking Air Force, not a Hebrew-speaking Air Force, because so many of them were South Africans as well, let's be honest, people from America, from Britain, from Australia and France and other countries. But the South African group was very much known there. And that idea of people that come here during war or before a war was very much respected. That, by the way, was continued in the 67 war, when there were almost 800 volunteers who came, significant numbers still living in Israel, and with the Yom Kippur War, 300 volunteers, once again, quite a few living in Israel today. Just to very quickly go through the categories, some were on the right-hand perspective, Shmuel Katz in the Etzel right-wing militia group, high command, and not just a regular person, but high command. We have them in educational television, the sport, the tennis association. One, as far as I know, Jewish South African minister in Israeli politics. By the way, there are very few South African Jews who got involved in Israeli politics. There may be good reasons for that. Tennis players, Bezalel School of Arts, Goldreich. He had been a very active person who actually escaped from South Africa because he was about to be in prison. Ezra, the English-speaking volunteer movement, Judge Joseph Herbstein, an ex-South African judge who was involved with Telfed, the Landsmannschaft, the absorption South African group organization, which has been very successful. Dancing, a very significant number of doctors. One could hardly go to a hospital in Israel on any occasion without asking, if one asked the question, are there any South Africans? And somewhere in the corridor, someone would shout, yes, of course, I'm one of them. So we have them not only as GPs, but in many of the very sophisticated high-level realms of the hospitals. Mendel Kaplan, who himself was the donor for the Kaplan Center, whose report we have been using, played a very important role in the Jewish Agency and World Jewish Congress, swimming championships, civil rights, Jews, South African Jews have been certainly involved in civil rights, Holocaust studies, and so on and so forth. Around the country, and I'm making a generalization, and I must admit that I'm biased, around the country, one feels the presence of South Africans, but it's only a very small number, only 25,000. But I think the feeling is that this was a group that came, wanted to be involved, coming from well-educated backgrounds, and have contributed considerably to the development of South Africa. I'm not excluding any other group, and this is not a competition of who's given most of the country. We're talking about South Africa in its own context. So on to the next one, we'll just get a little bit extra about what happened. As time went on, the kind of overview picture of South African Jews to Israel changed. Israel, as we know, has become more right-wing as a result of the Six-Day War. Israel took over 3 areas of land. From the religious right-wing perspective, this is liberated territory. From the left-wing perspective, this is occupied territory. Many of the HABONIM members in Israel, certainly not all, would very much resonate with a comment made by Professor Gideon Shimoni, who I mentioned initially, where I'll just quote the bottom of what appeared in the Haaretz newspaper in July of this year. Like many people with my background, I felt alienated in South Africa, but I never dreamt that I'd see the day when I would have the same sense of alienation here in Israel. Now, I'm quoting that because I think he's an important representative of HABONIM-DROR. He himself was a central leader of that movement. And I think this is, in a sense, showing that the South African Jewish community on the political level is a deeply divided one. This is not unusual in terms of Israel. You would find with many immigrants from America who came here in the early years, they themselves were in the youth movements. They see themselves on the left of the political spectrum, and some people who've come, not all, people who've come in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, in many cases would see themselves on the right of the political spectrum. This is significant in the case of South Africa because of the being in a youth movement was a culture. It wasn't just something you did on Sunday. It was something as part of who you were, the essence of your own personal identity. And therefore, what happens in Israel is very much going to be influenced by what you had expected or what you had hoped. We see this in another way when we look at the next slide, and that's the position of the BNEI AKIVA. Once again, with all the problematics of generalization, BNEI AKIVA had initially, 2 of them had been killed in Gush Etzion, which was under Arab control between 1949 and 1967. In the earlier groups had gone to kibbutzim, somewhat similar to the HABONIM-DROR. They had training on a farm not far from Johannesburg. But many of them, even if they are not living in the territories, in the liberated territories, West Bank, or they would use the term Judea and Samaria, they are now distant in their political perspective from those many who were in HABONIM-DROR. And here we see the Professor Bernard Lehrer, who speaks about the West Bank, and the 2 slides that pictures we have there are some of the very comfortable living conditions of people in the living in the West Bank in Judea and Samaria. We're getting towards the end, but just to look at 1 or 2 additional slides, and the next one would just to try and starting to sum up some of the ideas. What do we get from the Kaplan survey in a general picture? Firstly, 89% of all South African Jews living in South Africa at the moment have visited Israel, a massive figure. And people would often say, well, what does the figure mean? Because figures need explanation. If you took a figure of French Jews or even British Jews, the figure is very high as well. But that's 2 or 3 hours, 4 hours flight. It's a long trip from South Africa. And therefore, the fact that you have had almost you can walk around South Africa and meet Jews there and essentially ask the question, what did you see when you were in Israel? So it's such a very, very broad experience, something which obviously one cannot do nearly as easily in the case of many parts of America. They feel strongly attached to the state. 66% define themselves as strongly attached to Israel. They self-define as Zionists. They say half that they would support the elected government of Israel, right or wrong, no criticism regardless of what you actually think of that particular government. And of those who would consider leaving South Africa, 51% of those people would go to Israel. So very significant statement. I think the summary of the Kaplan Center tells us a great deal. What are the statistics? Until 1968, the figures were fairly small, but very regular, by the way. Then between 69 and 80, it reached the figure of 1,450. In independence, by the way, was once again a moment of tremendous tension. The figure went up, and the last year we have is 400. Once again, the total number is 25,000. On to the next slide, which is our second but last slide, is something, an article by Rebecca Rajman, who wrote an interesting article, 2013, and an invaluable book, which will appear a little later, of what she knows, writing in 2013, of demographic analysis of the immigrants who come here. Young, 87% are younger than 34. By the way, I think this is a significant phenomenon, because it means that they're going to be in Israel. They've already gone through university studies. They've already, in many cases, have their professions. They come into Israel. And I think it's the age factor is often an important mechanism of becoming part of the country. If you come in too old, it's much harder to really integrate yourself. She says very, very clearly that we're talking about a notably highly skilled population. Why do they come? Well, we spoke about the push, but there are different kind of pull factors, and not all of it is ideology. And maybe I've sort of concentrated too much on the philosophical side. But these two comments that we find in the article by Rebecca Rajman, I think are significant. It's the reality of Israel. Writing about people who are now living in Israel, one person said, schooling doesn't cost as much, not nearly what it costs in South Africa. Medical care here is much cheaper. Those were the two items that used to kill us every month when they were still in South Africa. And many immigrants coming to Israel who've sent their children to private schools, which are by and large expensive, and with those countries which don't have universal medical care programs, do come to Israel and suddenly find that the cheap schools, by and large, and very affordable healthcare are attractions to the state of Israel. Another comment is on another level, an emotional level, and very interesting. Israel is the only country in the world that welcomes us, wants us, and offers so many opportunities. And here we have that slide, ALIYAH, helping the Jewish people come home. This is what I think explains much of what South Africans feel when they come here. Whether they always feel that or not is obviously a totally different issue. On to the last slide is as a reference to sources. We have 4 sources which are immediately available on the internet. And firstly, Philip Gilon's book, 70 Years of South African ALIYAH. I took the one slide. You can read it, and it really is a remarkable document. The other is the David Graham's Kaplan Center survey. The full survey appears. By the way, it's a very readable survey. Sometimes you have these surveys that it's hard to grapple with all the figures. This one is presented in a readable mechanism. Gideon Chimoni's famous book, somewhat criticized. Not everyone has agreed with his comments. He came down quite hard on the Board of Deputies, certain decisions which they made, and the feeling of the liberal left Jews who felt isolated and not supported by the Jewish community. That is available on the internet. And the weekly South African Jewish Report, which is excellent for anyone who wants to get a feel of what's really going on a weekly kind of level, is found there. In addition, Rebecca Rajman's book, unfortunately not available on the internet, but it can be purchased, South African Jews in Israel. If anyone really wants to get a sense of what's going on, those sources, I think, would be terrific. My very last comment is you'll see my email address at the bottom there, pliptz@gmail.com. If any of you have any questions in watching this on YouTube, you are welcome to write to me, and I always respond. Thank you very much, and stay well. Thank you. Good